discrimination. But the center of any reparations program has to be cash payments. The only thing that closes a wealth gap is money. And I think a lot of the times when we have these discussions about, well, let's give scholarships and let's pay for Black people to go to college. One, the facts show that Black people with a college degree still earn less than white people, still have less wealth than white Americans who have a high school degree. So again, that discomfort with a cash payment is something I think we need to understand is also racialized, and this belief that Black people are not deserving or won't spend their money the way that people think that they should. But you cannot close a racial wealth gap without transferring wealth to the people who have the gap. So cash payments, to me, have to be centered to any program.
So how much? I mean, cash payments could be like $100, $1,000, $10,000, $100,000. Like, has that been part of the conversation yet? Like, how much money are we talking about?
There's certainly different scholars and activists who have worked on figures. Frankly, I'm less worried about the technical arguments. We can figure out how to send someone to the moon. We certainly can figure out a calculus for how much the descendants should get, how much is practical. What's much more challenging is convincing Americans that this is the right thing to do. If we look at what the wealth gap is, some people would say payments of $100,000 to $170,000 to close the racial wealth gap. Some people would argue for more. Some people would argue for less. But this is why there's been a bill to study the issue of reparations in Congress now for more than 30 years to answer those questions, and yet Congress will not even pass the bill out of committee.
Yeah, the bill was introduced by the late John Conyers. What's in the bill?
I mean, the bill is to produce a study committee to actually just study the issue of reparations. Should the descendants of enslaved people in this country be paid reparations? How would a program work? So all of those questions that people love to throw up to say, well, we can't do reparations because how would we do it? Well, there's been a bill that would study how to do it, and it has not been able to get enough support to get out of committee in Congress. So those are all questions that can be answered. The hardest part is to get the will in a society that has tried to downplay slavery, that has tried to downplay the role that racism has played, and has tried to downplay the singularity of the Black experience, that no other group in this country has had the same experience. And so I think that has been the biggest issue that we faced.
What reaction do you get when you talk about reparations with white people?
It depends. I haven't had a ton of conversations. This hasn't been my life's work. It's been something I've thought about for a long time, but it's not something that I've talked about regularly in public spaces. I think the initial response is almost always a defensiveness, almost always a sense that this is reparations, the concept of reparations is unfair, or what about, poor white people? Why should Black people get something for something that happened a long time ago? And I try to steer right into that discomfort. What is it about, talking about reparations for Black people specifically? Because we understand the concept of reparations in the law. If someone, a hospital kills my husband because of malpractice, we understand that even though I'm not the victim, that financial compensation in our law is a right way to address what has happened. We have paid reparations to the Japanese, for instance. We understand when Germany paid reparations to Holocaust survivors. So we get that concept in the law, but we have a very visceral reaction to Black people getting reparations. And that speaks to this ongoing narrative in America that tries to downplay slavery, and that we've really internalized a sense that Black people are undeserving and have gotten enough. So I try to steer, when I have those conversations with white Americans, right into that discomfort and then make the case, because I think if you read my article is a response to every reason I have heard white Americans give about why black people should not receive reparations. And if you just look at the facts of it, if you're open to the facts of it, I think it is hard to come away saying that this is not the moral and just thing to do.
You read that reparations aren't about punishing white people. I think that's an important point because I think a lot of people feel like it is about that.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to address that head on because I wanted to really get at why do we have this kind of visceral response, negative response to the idea of making restitution to people who we held in chattel slavery and who we allowed really the most egregious discrimination, legal discrimination that's antithetical to our idea of who we believe we are as Americans. And why do we respond that way? And I think it's because a lot of white Americans feel that reparations is a personal attack or a personal affront, that they are being accused of something or they are expected to feel guilty about things that they did not personally do. It's important to understand that reparations are to be paid by the federal government, that the federal government sanctioned the institution of slavery, and that this is a societal debt. It is not the debt of one race. It is certainly not the debt of people who did not themselves engage in slavery or Jim Crow, but it is a debt that our society owns. And as I say in the piece, you don't get to just claim the good parts of the society, a part of the society that makes you proud, that glorifies your country. You have to also own up to the society's wrongs. People should not feel that reparations is something personal. It is not.
Let's talk about the 1619 Project. This was a series of articles, videos, poems, reflections on the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved people arriving in the colonies. It was in Virginia. How did you think of the idea?
So I've been in some ways thinking about the year 1619 and its significance since I was in high school. And that's when I first came across a date in a book that my African American Studies teacher gave me by Lerone Bennett called Before the Mayflower. And when I saw that date, it was like a lightning bolt because as a high school student, my entire education, I'd never heard that date, and I never knew that enslaved people, that African people, that my people had been on this land that long, that we actually arrived here before the Pilgrims. And I think I understood, even at that moment, that there was a reason we had all heard about the ship, the Mayflower, and there was a reason none of us had been taught about the ship, the White Lion, even though it arrived a year earlier and was just as significant. So that intentional erasure and the power of that erasure has stuck with me. And, it's been a few years since I've been in high school, so it stuck with me all of those years. And so as the 400th anniversary was approaching, I had this nagging feeling in my stomach, this very unsettling feeling that this tremendous anniversary, when in America do we get to commemorate 400 years of anything, but one that I thought was so foundational to the American story was going to pass, and it was likely going to have very little fanfare. Most Americans probably were never even going to hear of the date, and like so much about the history of Black Americans in slavery, it was going to be buried and marginalized. And here I am at the New York Times, and I have a huge megaphone and platform. I could do something about that. But I didn't want it to be a history. What was so important, my life's work has been about trying to help us draw the connections from slavery, from legal segregation to the present, and show that so much about the America we live in right now can be traced back to that legacy if we only open our eyes to it. And I wanted to use that anniversary as a time not to just examine what happened in the past, but to really help us focus on how, if you look across modern American life, so much of our institutions, our politics, our culture can be traced back to slavery, and bring that story from the margins and make it central.
In looking at the history of slavery and the legacy of slavery, what was the emotional impact of that? I'm wondering if you were angry a lot of the time, just immersing yourself in history and in the injustices of the past.
Yeah, absolutely. This was the hardest project I ever worked on for many reasons. but the intensity of spending pretty much every waking moment for 9 months reading about the kind of constant atrocities that Black Americans went through, looking at images, reading first-person accounts, reading history, and I read, every single piece that went in the magazine. It took a toll. I was angry and I was sad a lot. I cried a lot working on this project. My husband can tell you I definitely had a short fuse. I drank too much. I ate too much. It took a toll on my body, and it took a toll on me mentally. And on top of that was the pressure of having to try to get this right, that if we were going to undertake this project to try to tell this 400-year sweep of history of people who have been so intensely marginalized both in society and in popular media, that the pressure to do it justice was very high. It was, some of the period feels like a blur. It was very emotional, and it was very straining.
And then add to that the emotion surrounding the recent police killings of African Americans and the protests surrounding them. Did that add to both your anger and the emotion?
Yeah, there's no way that it couldn't. I mean, I think where a lot of times white Americans have tended to view these incidents as kind of tragic but unrelated incidents, Black people do not, and we see them as part of a lineage of an ongoing struggle and mistreatment, and we feel them very personally. And when I saw what happened, first, of course, it was Ahmaud Arbery, there was Breonna Taylor. That's not unusual that we have the succession of Black people being killed either by vigilantes or by police. But I don't think I'd ever seen anything as horrific in the modern era as that police officer kneeling on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. As I write in the piece, I don't use the word lynching to describe anything but lynchings. I don't think that's a word that we should use as metaphor, but that felt like watching a lynching, and it was devastating. I couldn't watch the whole thing. I definitely cried. My friends, we were talking a lot during that period about the toll of that. And I felt, I think like so many Black people, really, really helpless and really, really hopeless. And writing is the one way that I could feel powerful in a moment where it feels like we don't have power.
I know you're a parent, and I don't know how old your child is, but I'm wondering if both the 1619 Project and the police killing of George Floyd and the protests surrounding that have led to conversations with your child beyond the conversations you typically have about racism in the U.S. Absolutely, though I should say we talk about race all the time in my household. It's the nature of my work. My daughter has had books on slavery and Jim Crow since she was 3 years old. So it's something that we talk about a lot, but she's 10 years old now, and her understanding of the world is very different, and the kind of simple way that you talk about things with a younger child just don't work anymore. She wants to know why, and it is the hardest thing as a parent when your child asks you, well, why would that police officer do that to him? And you don't have an answer because you don't know why. And how do you explain to your child, the sweep of 400 years of history that leads this man to think that that would be okay and he wouldn't get in trouble, and to feel so little humanity towards this man because he's a Black man? Those are really hard conversations, and I often wonder if I'm failing at them, if I'm either telling her too much or not explaining it well enough, because, of course, there's this tug as a parent between wanting to protect your child's innocence as long as possible,
but being black in this country and understanding by protecting her too much, I'm actually harming her.